Welcome back. As the new year gets going, all eyes are on this man, the Prime Minister of the country, who has recently returned, we understand, from a ski vacation in British Columbia and is facing now overwhelming pressure from within his own caucus to step aside. All of this happens as the most recent polling shows the Conservatives continuing to hold a large double-digit percentage advantage over the Liberals. My next guest says that Prime Minister Justin Trudeau has three options in front of him. Andrew Perez is a Liberal strategist and a principal at Perez Strategies. Andrew, thanks a lot. How likely is it that one of the options is that he steps aside as Liberal leader? How likely is that becoming? There is a large number now of Liberal MPs who are publicly calling for him to step aside. He surely cannot continue at this point.
Yes, Paul. I mean, you would think so. In the days following Finance Minister Chrystia Freeland's bombshell resignation, things have got worse for the Prime Minister. He is quickly losing grip on the leadership of the Liberal Party and his government. We've seen now that the Ontario, Quebec, and Atlantic caucuses have all expressed non-confidence in his leadership, and those MPs account for the vast majority of the 153-member Liberal caucus. And so what we're seeing is a political crisis for Mr. Trudeau at the worst possible time as we look ahead to January 20th, President Trump coming into the White House for a second time, who has threatened, an extremely punitive 25% tariff on all Canadian goods. And the problem for Mr. Trudeau is not only does he lack the political confidence of his own MPs, he now lacks the political capital to really go toe-to-toe and negotiate with the Trump administration. And that's why this has become a full-blown crisis, not just for the government and the Liberal Party, but for the country. Canada arguably faces the biggest threat to its sovereignty and its economic prosperity since the Second World War. And so what we really need, we need a new Prime Minister, a new Liberal Prime Minister, and we can get into the different options as to how that can come about.
Let's do that because you've essentially told us things that we already know at this point. So what are the options, the realistic options facing Justin Trudeau and the Liberal Party right now?
Yes, so I think the most realistic option is for Mr. Trudeau to announce his resignation and prorogue. Proroguing Parliament means essentially setting the pause button on Parliament. All the legislation before Parliament will die. And that prorogation will allow for the party for the Liberal Party to execute a leadership race that would have to be held in short order in no more than 2 or 3 months. Eventually, a new leader would be selected. That leader would be sworn in as Prime Minister. That Prime Minister could then announce a new cabinet, bring in a throne speech, which would lay out a new legislative agenda for the government. And of course, the timelines are extremely tight with Trump coming into power on the 20th. If Mr. Trudeau does not prorogue, the House of Commons is coming back on January 27th. I would expect the opposition parties to vote non-confidence in the government within weeks.
Yeah, so I want to go back to the proroguing scenario. Under that scenario where a leadership convention is called, a new leader is named, a new cabinet is formed, and a throne speech delivered, is there not pressure on that new Prime Minister who has not been elected by the Canadian public to call an election fairly soon, as did Kim Campbell many decades ago?
Yes, there would be immense pressure and the clock would be ticking. I suspect once the new Prime Minister introduced a throne speech and brought back Parliament, that the new government under the new Prime Minister would likely be defeated within days, if not weeks. There's always the possibility that one of the opposition leaders, most likely the NDP leader Jagmeet Singh or possibly the Bloc, could work with the new government and the new Prime Minister and support that government on an interim basis for a few weeks or a few months. So nothing is ironclad in this scenario, Paul. But yes, even with a new Prime Minister, there would likely be an election. But prorogation would buy this government time, probably 2 to 3 months. And so with prorogation, we would likely be looking at a spring election, Without prorogation, the country could likely be plunged into a general election as soon as February.
And so that brings us to the issue of a non-confidence vote. What is your sense of the lie of the land there, given the shifted position of the NDP, which voted to support the government repeatedly over the past year or so, now saying that it will vote no confidence? When do you think, if no confidence is where we're headed, a no confidence vote, how soon do you think that may happen?
If Mr. Trudeau does not prorogue Parliament before January 27th, when it's set to come back, I would expect the opposition parties to vote non-confidence within days. There are opposition days that are slated for the opposition parties in Parliament, and they can use those days to put forward a non-confidence vote. And so that could happen, as I say, within days of Parliament coming back on January 27th. But I do think that prorogation is increasingly looking likely. I think Mr. Singh and Mr. Blanchet, the leader of the Bloc, have been absolutely clear that they no longer have confidence in a government led by Mr. Trudeau. Now, would that change under a government led by a different Liberal leader and Prime Minister? I don't know. I think that is what remains to be seen. And so there is a scenario where a new Prime Minister following prorogation could buy some time, could introduce a budget. Now, that budget could be defeated and the country would be plunged into an election, but the government would only need one opposition party to support that budget in order for the government to stay afloat.
Okay, and we're basically out of time. So very quickly, you see a third option as well, and it has been talked about somewhat in the news media, and that's an immediate Liberal leadership race, a race that would start almost ASAP. How likely is that?
That's another possibility. And I think the third option is really the appointment of an interim prime minister, which has never been done in Canada. We've never had an interim prime minister. And so that would require the Liberal caucus in collaboration with the national executive, the national board of the party, to come to a consensus on who should lead the party and the government on an interim basis. That could be done during a Liberal leadership race, or if there wasn't a time for a leadership race, given the political and economic crisis we find ourselves in, that interim prime minister could actually lead the Liberal Party into a general election campaign. As I say, that would be an unprecedented scenario, as it's never happened in Canadian history.
Andrew, thank you for this insight. That's Andrew Perez, Liberal strategist.